Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Welcome to yet another session of a talk, but hopefully this will be something that is very pertinent to most of you here, and in particularly to Muslims and those who are concerned with human rights. The Palestinians have been suffering for many years, and the Palestinian Nakba, which was just commemorated, is the 60th year now since Palestinians been expelled from their homeland and made refugees. This catastrophe and suffering has been spun in so many different ways and woven in a style to an extent that it appears that the sufferers are really the perpetrators of the crime of being exiled. Now, this is an amazing situation, and I have with me eminent scholars to try and address this issue from different perspectives. We haven't given them a specific title. What I've asked them is to give their narrative, their understanding of the Nakba, either political, historical, or even from a military context. I have with me, starting from my left, Professor Dr. Noor Marsala, who is really an eminent scholar from Oxford. He has written...
No, University of Surrey, London. Sorry.
University of Surrey, London. He's written many books, particularly on the refugees, and he specializes on the refugees. He was born in Galilee in occupied Palestine in 1957, and he studied at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. And then he moved to London. In addition to publishing several books, he's also the director of the Holy Land Research Project and the associate editor of the Holy Land Studies. Next to him is a close colleague and a friend of mine, Dr. Azam Tamimi, a very well-known person, and he doesn't need much introduction, but he's the director of the Institute of Islamic Political Thought, but I think here he won't mind me referring to him as a Palestinian refugee. And very much next to Dr. Azam is Ilan Pape, again, a close colleague, and we tend to share platforms like this up and down the country. He's a professor of history at the University of Exeter. He moved very recently from Haifa, and hopefully he'll be able to throw some light on that. He has again written many books and written numerous articles in academic journals. To the far end, again, very close friend of mine, and I've one of the privileges to have been associated with Jenny, and she has brought faith into politicians. Jenny Tong, who was a MP for the Liberal Democrats, I think in the last elections, she sat down from her seat, and now she's a baroness in the Houses of Lords, and she represents the Liberal Democratic Party. And she has been an advocate for the human rights, and in particular for the human rights of the Palestinians. I will ask each speaker to spend something 10 to 15 minutes, and then we'll open the floor for questions and answers. To start from my left-hand side with Dr. Noor Marsala, please.
Thank you, Ismail. Thank you so much for having me here. Can you hear me in the back?
Yes.
Okay. I've got a bad cold, so I've got to scream in order to kind of make my voice clear. This year, we had a huge amount of coverage on the issue of the Nakba. Very unusual. A great deal of coverage on 1948 and on the 60th anniversary. And I think this is something to do with the fact the way we Palestinians try to highlight the issue, try to push the issue forward. I must say it hasn't been done by the Palestinian leadership. The Palestinian leadership continued to squabble, but it has been done by Palestinian civil society, by Palestinian NGOs, and by the refugees themselves. It is incredibly important to think about 1948 as a big issue for the Palestinians as a whole, but also for the refugees and the international community efforts try to silence the refugees. So I think the issue of the Nakba, the Palestinian catastrophe, I believe it will get into the English lexicon in the same way the Intifada, the word Intifada got into the English lexicon, perhaps in the same way the word Shu'ah, the Hebrew word Shu'ah, also got into the English lexicon. So it is an important thing to do. So the question is, what is 1948 for us? It's a key event. In 1948, we had a country called Palestine disappearing from the map. really literally disappearing from the map. Villages were wiped out. 70–80% of the people actually were driven from these parts of the Israeli state was created in 1948. Something like 531 Palestinian villages disappeared in 1948. Villages which existed for centuries. Remember, 800 years ago, we had the Crusaders, the Latin Crusaders, the fundamentalist coming to Palestine and trying to wipe out the landscape of that country. They did not succeed. You have a secular colonial Zionist movement, a secular movement arriving from Europe in the late 19th century, and within a short period of time, within about 40, 50 years, a whole country disappearing from the map, physically disappearing from the map. And the British, I'm afraid, the British did play a big part in it. The British occupied Palestine in 1917, 1918, ruled Palestine about 30 years, and again, the British left Palestine in 1948, the country disappeared from the map. So what is the British are going to say about this? The British and the Zionists are equally responsible for our catastrophe. Do we need to ask Tony Blair to apologize for this? I'll come back to Tony Blair. But here, I think you can't begin to deal with the Palestinian issue without looking at the original sin, what we call the original sin in 1948. Perhaps the original sin did not actually begin in 1948. Some people say the original sin began with the Balfour Declaration in 1917 when the Lloyd George government, the British government, the liberal government in Britain here promised a Jewish homeland in Palestine when the Jewish community in Palestine were about 5% of the population. I want to take you even back to the 19th century. In the 19th century, we have a Christian Zionist lobby based in London, operate from the heart of the British establishment and calling for the creation of a Jewish homeland. So I think the question of Zionism, the question of the question of re-establishing Jewish state in Palestine, in a country which was populated by other people, is actually a British question. It began by British Christians. It did not begin by Theodor Herzl. It was Christian Zionists in the mid-19th century who began to push this idea of a land without a people. That myth of a land without a people wasn't invented by Herzl. It wasn't invented by Jews. It wasn't invented by secular Zionists. It was invented by people who lived in the UK. So our conflict, our question, our catastrophe, if you want to go back to the roots of that catastrophe, it does go back to that British Protestant Zionism emerging in the 19th century and ending up with the Balfour Declaration, and then ending up with the 1948, the catastrophe. And then we end up with Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, who stated about a month ago that Israel was the greatest invention, the greatest creation of the 20th century. If Israel is the greatest invention of the 20th century, what about the Palestinians? Why the Palestinians are continuously being silenced by this government? Why is it that Gordon Brown is asking the Duke of Edinburgh and the Queen to host a celebration of the State of Israel on the 7th of April? By the way, the Duke of Edinburgh actually emerged quite honorable from this situation. The Prince Philip was asked to host a celebration for the Jewish National Fund, one of the most racist organizations in Israel, the organization which took part in the expulsion of the Palestinians in 1948. The heads of these organizations were the Advocates of Transfer, an organization which took part in the destruction. Gordon Brown is asking the Duke of Edinburgh to host a celebration for the Jewish National Fund on the 7th of April at Windsor Castle. The Duke of Edinburgh basically said he was ill. This is something really to remember about it. He didn't want to do it, but we have a government which is still silencing the Palestinians, silencing the Palestinian Nakba, silencing the Palestinian Holocaust, and celebrating the establishment of an apartheid state in Palestine, a state which is still colonizing the last bit of the land. So who would you trust more, Desmond Tutu, Jimmy Carter, or Gordon Brown? Listen to Tutu, who talks about an apartheid state creating conditions worse than Soweto, worse than apartheid Soweto. So the Palestinian Nakba is not finished yet. It's still unfinished business. When we talk about the Holocaust, we acknowledge the Jewish Holocaust, a dreadful thing. This is something which did happen in the past. The Palestinian catastrophe is an ongoing event. Palestinians are still being ethnically cleansed from Jerusalem. Gaza is under blockade. People are starving in Gaza. There's a kind of silence here in this country, a conspiracy of silence pushed by the British government on the current situation in Gaza. The best thing they can do is to send Tony Blair to the region to try to set up, to try to bolster the security capacity of the PA, basically the PA countering terrorism, if you like. This is what is happening. I mean, the British role in our catastrophe is still something ongoing. It's not something of the past. It's not an abstract thing. It is something which we need to remind people that things ought to be addressed. We have a sea change in public opinion in Britain. I came to the UK in the mid-80s. People didn't mention the word Palestine. Things have changed. There's a positive public opinion. Even the press is changing. Why is it that our government here, the British government, is not changing? Why is it? So the question of actually is not just about asking an apology, but it's actually about radical change from the top. From Balfour to Blair to Gordon Brown, the British government had a long history of doing the wrong thing. It's time for the British government to do the right thing. And it's time to put pressure on this appalling government. He's actually doing every mistake in the book, Gordon Brown. He's also doing a huge mistake on the question of their 60th anniversary. I think it's actually for us to do something about it, and there's a great deal people can do about it. And thank you so much.
Thank you, Noor. Our next speaker is Dr. Azam Tamimi.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله. Every year the Israelis celebrate the birthday of what they call Israel. At the same time, the Palestinians remember in pain the most catastrophic event in their history. And it's an irony. It's an irony that one side celebrates, the other mourns. There must be something wrong. And the Israelis call our Nakba a miracle. A miracle. Indeed, a miracle. Because how can you get the entire world to legitimize a crime without that crime being a miracle of some sort? The Palestinians had nothing to do with the Holocaust, had nothing to do with the pogroms, had nothing to do with the persecution of the Jews anywhere in the world in history. It wasn't even the Palestinians who forced the Jews out of Palestine so many centuries ago. It was the Romans. Yet the Palestinians were forced by the world and continue to be forced by the world to vacate their land in order for the Europeans to solve a problem of their own. This is what our Nakba is about. It's a miracle that so many world nation leaders traveled to Palestine this year to celebrate with Israel our own Nakba, our own catastrophe, to celebrate that my mother and that my grandparents and that the parents and the grandparents of millions of Palestinians were evicted from their homes, to celebrate. Can you imagine? Not only celebrate, bestow some sort of sacredness on this project which is nothing but a crime against humanity. Can you imagine, for instance, someone today standing up to defend slavery, what would you say? Can you imagine someone standing up to celebrate apartheid? What would you say? How come then that the leaders of the European nations, the leaders of the United States of America and Canada, the leaders of so many smaller nations in the world celebrate our pain and agony? Because this is not about a conflict between us, the Palestinians, and them, the Jews. This is something much bigger than that. Zionism, which continues to cause our pain, is a Western colonial project, not any different from any previous colonial project that claimed to bring civilization to the nations of the world by dispossessing them and by dehumanizing them, whether they were the nations of what is today America or what is today Australia and New Zealand or what remains of Africa and Asia. The same mindset. And therefore, when we talk about what happened in 1948, we talk about one of the gravest crimes against humanity that is to be in the same category as the Holocaust. And with this comes the demonization of the resistance. What would you do if your country is invaded? If you are attacked in your homeland? If your children are killed or threatened with murder? Would you just stand idly by? Or would you try and do something about it? Well, the Palestinians stood up and wanted to defend themselves and defend their country. And for that, they continue to be called terrorists. Why the demonization of Hamas, for instance? What does Hamas stand for? A national liberation movement. No different from the national liberation movements that liberated the African nations, the Latin American nations, and the Asian nations from colonialism. Why is Europe so hypocritical when it comes to the true representatives of the Palestinian people, those who were duly elected in one of the cleanest and fairest elections ever held in the Arab world? Because sacredness has been bestowed on Israel and on the Zionist project. Very few people dare criticize Zionism or Israel. Very few people dare stand up and speak. You'd immediately be accused of being anti-Semitic. And if you happen to be a Jew, then you are a self-hater. If you tell the truth, then you can easily be excommunicated and punished. What is happening to the world? And that's why when we remember the Nakba, one thing we have to remember, and that is our individual and collective responsibilities as human beings. We can never allow this forging of history to get by. We can never allow this bestowing of legitimacy on a crime against humanity. The creation of Israel was a crime against humanity. And Zionism is a racist organization, a racist movement that has to be uprooted from our human society. And let the world hear it. And let the world hear it again and again. By Allah, we will never rest. By Allah, we will never rest until Zionism is over and until Palestine is free and Jew, Christian and Muslim can live again in peace. Peace that is based on justice. That's how we must remember the Nakba. We must remember the Nakba with a new resolve, renewed resolve to continue the struggle, each within his own capacity, with a pen, with a word, or with whatever means you have in order to change this hypocrisy that has gripped our world. Thank you very much.
Jazakallah khairan, Dr. Azzam. Just to remind our listeners and our visitors that Dr. Azzam's book is available, his book on Hamas, from Al-Hiwar stand, And also, I've also seen Ilan Pape's book and Nur Masala's book as well in some of the other bookshops. So almost all the speakers, if you want to buy their books, they're available in the souk area. Our next speaker, Dr. Ilan Pape, please.
I was born 6 years after the Nakba to a family whose both my parents came from Germany in the 1930s to Palestine. They both lost all their immediate relatives in the Holocaust. And I grew into a lie. I grew into the Zionist project through its educational system, through the media and the political discourse that envelops everyone who was born at that time in Israel. And it took me the best part of 20 years to find out that I was living in a lie. It was not just the lie about the Nakba. It was the lie about the empty land of Palestine that was given to the Jews after being desolate and empty for 2,000 years. It was the city of Haifa in which I was born, and I saw hardly any Palestinians in it, that was emptied by force 6 years before during the Nakba, and there was no indication to me as a young boy that this ever happened. And it took me about 20 years to find a way out of the lie. And it's not easy to find a way out of the lie in Israel. Not only because of what you are being taught in Israel, and not only what you hear from your parents, your teachers, your journalists, and your leaders, but also because when you travel abroad, especially to the United States, the lie is being reaffirmed as reality and truth. And it was only in the 1980s, since I chose to be a professional historian, that I realized that I was living in a lie. In fact, the evidence was all the time there, I found out. And everyone who wanted in my home city, Haifa, or elsewhere, to find out the truth could have done it many, many years before, including myself. But you need some sort of an awakening. You need some sort of a trigger to enable you to look at the reality in a different way from the way that you've been indoctrinated, in the way that you've been humanly engineered. And for me, the trigger was meetings with Palestinians outside of Israel. Meeting them in a free mode, if you want. Meeting them as equal colleagues in an academic setup. Meeting them in the archives where we all looked for evidence of what happened in the past. And this was the trigger that slowly, like you peel an onion, and it was as tearful as peeling an onion. When you peel an onion, you sort of, one layer after the other, you see how enormous the lie was and how terrible the reality was. And ever since you discover it, there's no way back. And ever since I understood that in 1948, the Zionist movement committed the crime against humanity and ethnically cleansed Palestine, I understood that I had a mission in life to tell that truth, especially to the people I lived with in Israel, but also to the world at large. And ever since I realized that the lie was clear and transparent to everyone in the West in 1948, but they chose intentionally not to tell the truth, I understood that one has also to challenge the Western position on Palestine. When the Israeli forces destroyed half of Palestine's villages and demolished half of Palestine's cities and expelled almost half of Palestine's population out of the country, all kinds of Western representatives were on the ground. There were journalists, there were representatives of the International Red Cross, there were emissaries of the United Nations. When you go to the archives, you can read their very honest reports about the crimes that were committed against the Palestinian people in 1948. But their leaders, their director generals, their editors-in-chief, and their politicians decided not to publish one word of it. There was a conspiracy of silence that continues to this very day. So it's not just enough to commemorate and record what happened in Palestine, which is a sacred mission. It is also important to ask the West to be accountable for more than 60 years of being involved in a conspiracy of silence, a cynical, sinister conspiracy of silence of people who pretend to be, in this age of the so-called war against terror, to be champions of humanity, progress, democracy, and liberalism. It is not only the Israeli generals and politicians who are criminals, it's also the Western politicians who take part in this conspiracy in silence who are criminals. If you see a crime and you don't report it, you are a criminal yourself. And I think it's high time for all of us to say that it's impossible, despite the miracle that Azam rightly talked about, it's impossible to think that another 60 years would pass and the same lie would continue to be maintained as reality and truth. We would call the liars liars, and we will call the occupiers occupiers, and we'll call the colonizers colonizers, and we'll make sure that their fate will be like the fate of all the colonizers, occupiers, and ethnic cleansers in the past. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ilan. Our final speaker is Jenny Ton.
Thank you very much, and a big thank you, first of all, to those three speakers that we've just heard. I hope you realize how much guts it takes to actually speak in the way that they have spoken. It is not easy nowadays. There is always someone waiting for you in the wings to try and shut you up. And I'll tell you a little about that later on. But they are very brave, and they deserve a tribute from all of us. Now, I say at the beginning of any speech that I ever make on this subject that I think that the Holocaust was probably the worst, most organized, most deliberate, most tabulated, most recorded crime that's ever been committed against humanity. I think most people would agree with that. It was extraordinary in its planning and its effectiveness. But since then, because we in the West felt desperately, and still do, totally guilty about the Holocaust and allowing it to happen, because of that, we allowed the creation of the State of Israel. And I have to say, the Balfour Declaration did acknowledge the need for a state for the Jewish people, but also said that they mustn't do any harm to the people of Palestine when they created it. But since then, we've had 60 years of what I can only describe as slow strangulation of the Palestinian people. I've seen it all. I think the thing that affects me most of all is the way young people are treated by the Israelis. The way the Israel Defense Force will arbitrarily just march into a school, arrest some kids, and throw them in prison to teach them a lesson just for a few weeks, sometimes months. I think there's 8,000 young people at the moment in Israeli prisons, not charged with anything, just there as a sort of preventative measure. being hardened, being brutalized, being made more resentful and more determined when they come out to fight the occupation. But I've seen evidence of the assassinations from the helicopter gunships, the house demolitions, the scandal and obscenity of the settlements on other people's land, and the way the settlers treat the Palestinians around them in the most disgusting way. I've seen the water, which is now controlled by Israel. I think 80% is controlled by Israel, and the Palestinians have very little, while up the road in a settlement, the Israelis are sprinkling their lawns to keep them green. The land has gone, the olive trees and the orange groves have gone. The special roads for Israelis and the Palestinians cannot get across them or through them, so travel is almost impossible. The permit system. I was there in February actually investigating the permit system, and it is quite extraordinary, the permits you have to get permits to be able to do something. And if you happen to have a medical condition and you need a permit for medical treatment, heaven help you, because you'll probably be dead by the time the permit comes through. Children prevented from going to school, families prevented from being united, husbands and wives having to live separately. And why all of this? We have to understand, ladies and gentlemen, that this has to happen, the Israelis and their supporters say, because of the risk of suicide bombers and the risk of Qassam rockets going from Gaza into Israel. So this enormous apartheid infrastructure and brutalization of a whole people is being done to protect the Israelis. Now, I can understand that. I've talked to Israelis and I've seen Israelis, and some of them are very, very frightened people indeed. So there is a reason for all of it. But I cannot understand how they think it is in their long-term interest to do the things that they do. How does Israel possibly think that without the massive support of the United States, and you know Israel is the biggest recipient of American aid in the whole world, of all the poor and underdeveloped countries in the world, Israel receives the most money from the USA. And on top of that, there are charities all over the USA raising even more money to support individual institutions in Israel. How does Israel ever think they are going to survive in the long term when America is not top country anymore? And that will happen. America will not be top country forever. China's coming up very fast in the outside lane, and so is India. The Americans are not always going to be top dogs, and what will Israel do then? And how does it possibly think that it is going to stop anti-Semitism coming back all over Europe if it doesn't stop treating the Palestinians in this way? Because there are many, many people in the West and in my own country here who cannot distinguish between Israel and Jews. And we know there are people here today who know perfectly well there is a big distinction between Israel and the Israeli government and their supporters and Jewish people all over the world. They are not guilty for what the Israeli government is doing. Now, on the other hand, people who criticize Israel are often called anti-Semitic for doing that. So the people, the Israel lobby, which I like to call it, in this country, is doing even more damage by saying, if you criticize Israel, you're being anti-Semitic. That means Israel and the Jews are one and the same thing. That is wrong, 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 ladies and gentlemen, and we must resist it. for the sake of, yes, very, very good, dear Jewish friends and colleagues that we all have, we must keep saying that quite clearly. Now, everyone says we don't understand. Why do they behave like this? How do they get away with it? 60 years of abuse of human rights and breaking international law and disobeying UN resolutions. 60 years of it. How do they get away with it? Well, I'll tell you how they get away with it. I've personally experienced it. It is now very well written about and being increasingly recognized. It is the lobby. The lobby, the pro-Israel lobby, is extremely strong in America in the form of the America-Israel Political Association known as AIPAC, and it was written about by Walt and Mearsheimer, two professors at Harvard University, Harvard and Chicago universities, and they were almost thrown out of the United States for writing that book. They certainly got into an awful lot of trouble. I've met them both, and they contest that it is the lobby in America which makes all political parties obey the will of Israel. And in this country, we have the Friends of Israel who operate in every political party in this country. It's not one, and therefore you can't really criticize them for it. Everyone is entitled to lobby for their cause. They are there in every party. They help, they deliver leaflets, they raise funds, they work very hard, they canvass, they tell at election times. They are part of the body politic. Where are the Palestinian supporters in those political parties? Where are they? But this is the way they wield so much power. Because basically, ladies and gentlemen, politicians, and I am one of them, are cowards. We don't like to offend everybody, anybody. We think that we can please all of the people all of the time, and therefore they'll carry on voting for us and we'll keep our jobs. That is how the lobby works. It makes itself so useful to individual politicians and political parties as a whole that they can't do without them. And therefore they don't want to offend them. Therefore they won't speak out against the activities of the Israeli government. That is how it works. And the answer is to be as strong as that lobby. Don't complain about it. Get stuck in there. Join a political party, any political party. Make yourself indispensable to them. And if you don't want to go that far, make sure that every week of your existence there is a letter or an email from you about Palestine in your Member of Parliament's office. It's not much to ask. There are people out there who are dying and suffering and starving because we're not doing enough to support them. And the only way we can do it is to drive our politicians stark raving mad about this issue. We must do it in every way we can, because I feel passionately that the Palestinian problem lies at the very, very roots of the so-called terrorism problem we have in the world today. That's where it originated. We are facing a situation in this world where America, backed by our own government in this country, thinks that the way to deal with it is bombing other countries. And I do say to myself sometimes, what is the difference between a suicide bomber and a bomber pilot flying at 30,000 feet who drops bombs on people and kills them, hundreds of people? What is the difference? The difference is, of course, that that bomber pilot is legitimized by a government and he goes home for his drink in the bar that evening, and the suicide bomber gives his life for his cause. Now, I don't want to see any violence in the world. I don't condone any of it. But we have got to stop thinking that bombing Iraq and going to war in Afghanistan, and yes, it's on the horizon now, doing the same thing to Iran, is going to make any difference whatsoever to the war on terror, because it isn't. It will spread terrorism even further. It will make the world even more unstable. A war in the Middle East will spread worldwide, and that is a danger to everybody. So I beg of you, ladies and gentlemen, please don't go home tonight and think you've done your bit. You've listened to all of us sounding off about Palestine. Go home and resolve to do something about it. Drive those politicians mad.
Thank you very much. We've had a lot there to think about, and it's always amazing that whenever we have a gathering like that, there's new issues that crop up from our speakers, and that just shows the depth of their understanding of the issue. And we've had Noor talking about the need to apologize in British culture, especially British political culture. We've had our Prime Minister apologizing for all sorts of things, for the slavery, of course, which was needed, the Irish plight, Birmingham 6, yet we seem to fail, and fail miserably, to apologize for the Balfour Declaration, which brought about the Nakba, or at least the genesis for the Nakba. We've also had Azam throw us a narrative and an understanding of colonialism and why the Western world in particularly supports Zionism. Ilan's personal journey, if you like, was very enlightening, and somebody might want to question him. And Jenny, of course, trying to differentiate between Judaism and Zionism. And more important than that is the final few words which she mentioned, is do something about it. I'll open up the floor, but before I do, I would like you to get your hands together and thank my speakers on behalf of Friends of Al-Aqsa, and in particular today, Islam Expo. Thank you very much. The procedure is quite straightforward. Please raise your hands. We'll take one question at a time. We have speakers. I'll point them out, and the roaming mics will go to you. I'll start with the brother on the right-hand side with the red book.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you for the talk. I myself come from Cyprus, a country that is under current still illegal occupation by Turkey. The northern part of the country is not recognized by any national body. Though it happened in 1974, we're coming to a slow but peaceful resolution. My question for the talkers is, how effective do you think suicide bombings carried out by Hamas and Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade, as well as other militants, have been in furthering the cause of the Palestinians?
Okay, we'll take each question at a time, and I think we've come from the most hot questions right at the beginning. Start with you.
Suicide bombings, I think, is actually counterproductive. It's a tactic of desperate people. It's a tactic of the weak, of the marginalized, of the victim, of the one who is a refugee in Gaza, of those people who had brothers and sisters killed by the Israelis. A lot of revenge, even personal revenge, gone into it. It's a complex phenomena. But the bottom line is, I think it is counterproductive. It just does play into the hands of the Israeli leaders, those people who want to keep heading. In the past year, we had 11 Israelis killed and 400 Palestinians killed. We had a couple of small suicide attacks actually carried out. But you can see how the Israelis just use that tactic, which I think it is ineffective. I think it is counterproductive. I think it is indiscriminate. I think hitting soft targets, it is not justified. Maybe Azam would actually say something about it. I think July the 7th here was wrong. I think hitting soft Israeli targets actually doesn't produce anything for the Palestinians. On that pragmatic question, not just question of issue, I think I would actually see it as a counterproductive tactic myself.
So, I'll get Ilan to take this, please. That's how I'll put you on the spot. There's your mic.
Ah, sorry. No. Please, radio. I think that if I would sort of deal with the question from a different angle, you know, when someone is strangulated, you see someone that is being strangulated, and you ask yourself, how effective is the fact that he tries to hit the strangulator on the head? Is it effective or not? Probably not if he's a strong strangulator. Probably not if you are relatively weak in hitting him on the head. The main question is, do we know how to end the strangulation? And as long as the world will not accept non-violent means to stop Israel, such as boycott, sanctions, and divestment, turning Israel into a pariah state, so it would stop doing what it do, you cannot expect the Palestinian to sit quietly and do nothing when for more now than 40 years they are being occupied, oppressed, massively killed, and the houses being demolished, and they are being abused on a daily basis in the checkpoints. So it's not a matter of only effectiveness and legitimacy. It's a matter of finding an alternative strategy that can only be effective if the West is going to condone it. And the West, because of all the things we heard this afternoon, is still not willing to treat Zionism as it even treated apartheid in South Africa.
Thank you very much for two comprehensive answers. I've got Rabbi Wise from New York. Okay, Rabbi Wise is an Orthodox Jewish, and unfortunately he cannot use electronic equipment, so I'll say what he's asking me.
I can't thank you enough, speakers. I know it means sacrificing pleasure and life to speak out about the issue of Palestine. We live it day. I just would like to say that at the time, I'm a student of Rabbi Leitner, passed away this last year. He was a student of the chief rabbi of Jerusalem, Rabbi Dushinsky, who was in 1947, 1948 the chief rabbi. My rabbi, Rabbi Leitner, told me he bore witness that he was there when the United Nations sent a delegation to inquire if the populace wants a state. The Christians and the Muslims obviously didn't need a Jewish state. Rabbi Dushinsky pleaded with them not to have the state. There was a letter in the United Nations where he said in 1947 November, he said, at least leave Jerusalem. I just want to say we are forbidden, according to the Jewish law, to have a state since the destruction of the temple. We are forbidden to oppress the Palestinian people. We thank you all. May God bring a peaceful and speedy dismantlement to the state. And then we can live again in harmony as we have hundreds of years. But thank you to the Muslim countries for their hospitality of always shown.
Can you give me the rabbi's name?
Rabbi Dushinsky of blessed memory.
Thank you. It's a very important point the rabbi has made, that in 1947-48, when the United Nations sent a team to investigate what the people of Palestine wanted, whether they wanted a petition or to create a state of Israel, the chief rabbi of the time in Jerusalem, the chief rabbi of Jerusalem, who happens to be the teacher of the Rabbi Wise's teacher, so second in line, actually told the United Nations Committee that they did not wish to petition Palestine and create a state of Israel, as this was against the Judaic teaching. It's a very, very important point. Thank you for that. Can I have that gentleman there, please? Okay. Hello.
Well, I would like to take Dr. Tong's message and appeal to us a step further. A few years back, the Lord Sachs was asked as the chief rabbi in the UK, with people asking him, where were God when the Holocaust took place? He replied to them by saying, don't say that, say where is man? Where was man when the Holocaust took place? I wrote to several organizations asking them to publish a letter saying, where is man? Where is the Lord today, seeing the injustice in Palestine? You are asking people to write to their politicians, and many of them may or may not be able to do that. And my appeal to everyone in here is that we have 5 brave people in here. Everyone has seen the pressure of the Jewish lobby when they speak on behalf of the Palestinians. But as a parent, no one should stop me asking for a Palestinian point of view when the Holocaust, for example, takes place and people are teaching it at school. So in assemblies and in schools, we need to see the other side of the coin and an explanation of the Palestinian catastrophe, because that is the new generations have to learn from there. And my last comment was, Yitzhak Rabin was shot dead because he said something very important. The lie that Ilan Pappé was referring to, a land without people for people without land. In the House of Knesset, he said that when we came to Palestine, it wasn't empty. And he said a special word. In Hebrew, he said, Banu Nu'am were there. Banu Nu'am in Hebrew, which I can understand in Arabic, is our cousins were in Palestine and we've killed them. And he appealed to his fellow MPs to stop the killing and go for peace. Unfortunately, he paid with his life, but I think any one of us here today should go back to schools, to politicians, and write for that. And I salute people for what they are doing.
Thank you for your comment. Can we reserve it to questions? I saw a hand of a sister in yellow t-shirt on the left-hand side. My left-hand side, please.
Hi, I wanted to know what the panel thinks about the issue of oil in the Middle East and how influential it was in the creation of Israel and its continued existence. Because from where I can take on board the issue of the lobby, and I'm sure that's very important, but from where what I can see, there are many, many lobbies, as pointed out. And the issue that seems to me to be keeping Israel in existence seems to be that it acts as a military wing of the US. I mean, they attacked Hezbollah or Lebanon only a couple of years ago, and now they're threatening to attack Iran because the US can't do it. So I'd like to know what the panel thinks about oil as an issue where Israel is concerned. And I have a second question, if that's okay. It's about the resistance. I was very inspired by the fact that the Palestinians broke through the wall into Egypt recently. And I'd like to know if there's a potential for another intifada. And also, I don't know how many people are aware of the massive strikes in Egypt that have also expressed solidarity with the Palestinians. I'd like to know if you think there is a possibility of wider solidarity in the Arab world with the Palestinians. Thank you.
I would just like to recap the question, really, a very, very important question here. Is there economic benefit for our country and the United States of America in supporting Israel? Jenny, maybe you might want to...
Sorry, can you repeat that?
Is there an economic benefit for our country and the United States of America in supporting the state of Israel?
Well, there is an economic benefit. There is also a political benefit because the state of Israel and its very, very strong lobby does so much to support political parties in this country, as I explained. It's a very complex relationship, I think. I take your point. I always call Israel the USA's aircraft carrier in the Middle East. A massive, great country, armed to the teeth by America, but now strong enough, of course, to make most of its own arms, and it is heavily armed, excused from all the nuclear ban treaties and all the agreements on nuclear weapons. You know, it's very difficult. It's easy to understand why Iran is so twitchy about nuclear weapons when it's got Israel armed to the teeth and won't admit it and not subject to any of the nuclear agreements. So I think it's a very complex thing. I'm not so sure that oil has that much to do with it because the Americans have got so many allies on that front already, Saudi Arabia being the main one, that I'm not sure that oil is directly involved. But what I am sure about is at the moment in the United States of America, there is a Christian Zionist movement like there never has been before. Fundamental Christians, and I am ethnically a Christian. I have to tell you, I don't have any faith now, but ethnically I'm a Christian. the fundamental Christians earnestly believe that Armageddon will come when the righteous are gathered in the land of Israel. And by that they mean the land of Israel from the Mediterranean to the River Jordan and down and up. I mean, that's Eretz Israel, I think it's called. That's what they look for. They are backed by the neocons, the very, very right-wing group headed by Dick Cheney in America. And they are supported to some extent by a lot of people in our government. I'm very disturbed by the number of people at Westminster who are vehemently, evangelically Christian, with a great love of the concept of the land of Israel because of that. So I think it's very complex. I think there is a very, very big emotional religious element. There is a practical political element. And one of the things Professor Pape mentioned was going for boycotts and sanctions against Israel. Rather than anything else, what my party is been calling for is a review of something called the EU-Israel Association Agreement, which actually is responsible for 60% of Israel's trade. Now, if we reviewed that agreement, we would see that the agreement depends on Israel respecting the human rights of Palestinians and obeying international law. Now, that agreement has been in existence for decades, and yet they have carried on as they have, and we've done nothing about it. We say that agreement should be reviewed and suspended until Israel actually does what they're told to do. But no one will listen. In fact, what's happened in the last 2 weeks is that Israel and the European Union have strengthened and deepened that agreement. So the power, I go back to it, I promise you, the power of the pro-Israel lobby in the West is enormous. It's very complex reasons, but it is enormous. And the only way we can fight it is to try and be as powerful ourselves.
Thank you, Jenny. On the same point, Noor, please.
Yeah, I think there were actually a number of issues raised, extremely important. One of the issues about the intifadas, they began as mass movements. The whole society took part in them. Mobilization, women took part. It was a peaceful movement. They began as, and also the break in Gaza, it was also a peaceful kind of break, by the way, the attack on the Egyptian. So I think that the Palestinians have continued to resist in all sorts of ways. And one of the ways of resisting the Israeli occupation was creating mass movements. And I think we ended up with suicide attacks, but this was one tactic. The trouble with suicide attacks, they tend to marginalize most society. Most people, once they see suicide attacks and see the level of violence, actually, they become aloof from it. They actually, so I think that Palestinian resistance has been most effective at that mass level, and the situation in Gaza, of course, is intolerable, and it will erupt, and we will end up with another intifada, and the best intifadas which the Egyptians could not resist. It's not just the Israelis. The Egyptians could not shoot hundreds of thousands of Palestinians breaking that wall. It was actually an intifada against not the Israelis, just also the Egyptians. The Palestinians at their best, at their most powerful, is that mass movement of hundreds of thousands of people marching. And it has been very effective. And I think we need to go back to that tactic plus that. But I actually want to say something about the lobby. I've got a new book called The Bible and Zionism, which looks at the issue of the lobby and the Zionist lobby, these hundreds of thousands of Christian Zionists in America. I think the lobby does explain part of that support. It does not explain the whole consistency of American support for the colonial state of Israel. American policy in the Middle East is a colonial policy, it's an imperialist policy. Oil is at the heart of that policy. Economic interests are at the heart of the policy. They're not going to invade Zimbabwe, are they? They're not going to invade Tibet or other places. Oil, Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, the Gulf, Saudi Arabia, is actually the critical. So you can't explain it just by looking at the lobby. I think the lobby is a big thing. But the reason why that policy is so consistent, because Israel is an aircraft carrier. It's not sinkable. The Americans see Israel as the most stable country in the region. They can't trust their allies in Saudi Arabia. and in Egypt and in Jordan, they see the Saudis very fragile. They see Saudi actually family corrupt, can collapse. Israel is the most stable country in the Middle East for them, is the most reliable country. Israel serves American interests in the Middle East. Without understanding these deep economic, colonial, imperialist interests, American policy in the Middle East is replacing British colonial policy in the Middle East. The Jewish homeland in 1917, conceived by the Lord George Governor as part of the British Empire. The British Empire is gone. Now we have the American Empire in the Middle East. Without understanding the colonial nature of the American Empire in the Middle East, you can't explain why they're so consistently behind Israel. Of course, the lobby fits into that thing, but the two things are part of it. It's not just one kind of explanation.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, I see a lot of hands coming up, but time is against us. But before I finish, very, very briefly to my speakers, if they want to say literally for 1 minute, any concluding remarks. I don't know, Jenny and Noor has had an opportunity. They want to go, they can. Otherwise, Ilan and Azam, please.
Azam, maybe? No, I have nothing else to add.
There's nothing to add. Jazakallah khairan. Just to finish off, one concept which I would like to sort of highlight from the question that was raised about breaking into Egypt. Palestinians have been considered and written as the uncivilized people. But it is incredible that these people who were starved for a year, who didn't have food on their plate, when they broke that wall, not a single crime was reported from Egypt. Not only that, they did not break into any shops, there were no riots for food, and each and every Palestinian wished to return back to Gaza, which is a prison. This is the resistance of the Palestinian people. And if anybody wants to have a comparison, and it is a sad thing, remember what happened in America when Hurricane Katrina hit them. There was mass riots, there was looting taking place. Yet the Palestinians, who are considered uncivilized in the Western world, showed how humanity should behave. With these words I end, and I hope that you thank my speakers one more time. Thank you very much to you all as well.